We did want to talk about the article that we had brought up to you earlier. So last week in our student newspaper, the Maroon News, a student wrote complaining about the so-called overt sexuality of queer culture on campus. That article has since been responded to by a group of students who wrote a letter to the editor basically shutting that down. And so queer culture and queer community was often misrepresented or reduced to harmful stereotypes. So we were wondering, how does Queertopia help us reimagine what queerness is?
The whole concept of Queertopia is that there's room for everyone, and it's a judgment-free space. Just because someone is doing something in their life that might be different from what you would want to do, it doesn't have to mean that it's bad. And I think we have to move away from this idea that any one person or even any particular small group of people is somehow the representation of the whole, because our queer community is diverse as any community. I haven't read the article, either of the articles, but I've heard people talking about them, and I love controversy. Actually, I have no problem with that. Controversy is why I have a career, so keep writing, whoever you are out there. But also, when people say things like that, I often feel like it's more of a reflection of that person, their journey, and perhaps things that have been said to them in their life or fears that they have about how they're being seen. I don't feel angry about it. I think that everyone's journey is different. And there was certainly a time in my own life growing up when I would have said very homophobic things myself because I was echoing what I heard and I didn't know any differently. And I think if you're afraid of how you're being perceived, it's very easy to latch on to some of those kinds of things because you don't want to be associated with someone who's doing something that you feel would be judged. Everyone's different, but what I heard about the article anyway is that it brought up something about these coloring books that I've made, and I will address that because again, you buy them on Amazon.com if you want. The coloring book was called Cheesecake Boys, and I'm not ashamed of it. It's one of the most popular things I've ever made. It's a coloring book inspired by classic pinup art, which I love, the old pinup girl paintings.
Straight pinup art.
Right, yes, very straight. I just, about 10 years ago, thought, how cool would it be to take some of those same scenarios and swap them and use male models or masculine identifying models? So in a very cheeky, fun, playful way, it is challenging some of those gender stereotypes too, because a lot of men were very uncomfortable with the book at first because they weren't used to seeing themselves portrayed that way. Male sexuality was often depicted in a much more macho, in control scenario, and then the women were shown in a very different way. So I wanted to flip that script. People can have multifacets to who they are. I do a lot of things that are somewhat adult-oriented, like coloring books, or some of my paintings, or some of the queer projects I've done, but I also do work with young kids. From kindergarten on, I teach students every week. I have private students, I go into schools, I have my anti-bullying project with kids, and I'm very careful to keep those parts of my life separate. And it's not because I'm ashamed, but it's just what's appropriate for each group. So I think we have to allow people to be multi-dimensional humans and not judge them for one aspect of their life when they're in the middle of trying to do something else.
Slay.
Yeah.